Kelly O'Keefe runs the Brand Center, and that is one that really is, well, that's a pinpoint that makes us the innovative, creative center of the universe, and we'd like to welcome Kelly O'Keefe. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm not sure. It's awesome to be here. Speaking with such great other speakers. To me, for Richmond to be able to attract these kind of people, for Richmond to be able to attract all of you to come out and listen and participate in this community event. It's just a dream come true for those of us who've been part of the creative community for a while and are now really seeing it become powerful and important as part of this city. So I'm going to talk about disruption. And to me, disruption is kind of a tricky word. I started to think about disruption. And there's good disruption, and there's bad disruption, right? If you tried to come out here today and you wanted to get here in time, but you realize that you're in a traffic jam because it happens that the President of the United States is speaking across town, you were disrupted and it was uncomfortable for you. It was bad disruption. Although it's good that the President is here. I must say, if he moved his speech so he didn't conflict with the Republican debate, I think he could have moved his speech so he didn't conflict with us, but so I see where we rate. Anyway, so I want to talk about disruption. I want to start by talking about negative disruption because it's something we're dealing with today in a lot of areas. And I'm going to start in my hometown and tell you a little story about Detroit. I grew up in Detroit, actually in Grosse Pointe, which is a suburb of Detroit, and I'll explain that distinction a little more in a moment. Not 10 or 12 blocks from our first speaker, Andy, who also grew up in Grosse Pointe. And Detroit was an interesting place back then. To put it in perspective, the Fortune 500 in 1956, the top 5 companies in the world, the largest 5 companies in the world, 3 of them were headquartered in Detroit. My father worked for one of them, Chrysler. And Detroit, at that time, was the most prosperous city in America. It was powerful. The roads were big and well paved. There was money everywhere. The best MBAs came out of school, and they wanted to go to Detroit because 3 of the largest 5 companies in the world were there. It's almost inconceivable to imagine that today, but that was the way it was. And in fact, back in the 30s, we were so in love with this concept of the industrial world that we were building and the power and majesty of it, that people like Charles Sheeler, one of my favorite painters, painted these paintings of the Ford River Rouge plant, which was the manufacturing plant that was so enormous that people came and photographed it because they thought, this is the best thing. Look at what we're doing. It's so awesome. That river in that painting is the Rouge River. In 1969, the Rouge River caught on fire. The flames went 50 feet into the air. It had so much oil sludge in it. In 1985, that oil sludge had combined with raw sewage, all kinds of industrial and human waste, and somebody fell into the Rouge River, was in there about 5 minutes, came out, and he died from poisoning. Imagine falling into a river and dying from poisoning. Somehow this wonderful industrial world built in Detroit, these massive companies with all this power, it wasn't working out. Detroit had other problems. This is a picture of waterfront homes on Windmill Point in Grosse Pointe. Beautiful homes. This is a picture of waterfront homes on Alter Road in Detroit. Not so beautiful. But what's significant is, if you look at this picture, the homes on Windmill Point are on the right side of the picture on the water. And those photographs from Alta Road, they're right on the left side of the picture. And that line is the line between Grosse Pointe and Detroit. And in the 1960s, Grosse Pointe was 98% white, and Detroit was almost 98% black. And that was not good. In fact, it led to race riots in 1967, where much of the city's downtown burned. It was rough. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in Grosse Pointe. It was not long before he was shot. He came to Grosse Pointe to speak at Grosse Pointe High School in 1968. I was 8 years old at the time. I didn't see it. And he had death threats from people in Grosse Pointe, this all-white community. His life was threatened. And an interesting thing happened at that time, which is that the white chief of police in Grosse Pointe, when he heard about the death threats, he had planned to drive the car to drive Martin Luther King to the event. He got one of his officers to drive the car, and he went into the back seat, and he sat on Martin Luther King Jr.'s lap, so that if a bullet came through that car, it would go into him and not into Martin Luther King Jr. And I read that story a few years ago, and I was so moved, and I looked everywhere online, everywhere I read the story. It never mentioned the name of this guardian angel. But my sister is a librarian in Detroit, and she found it for me, and his name is Jack Rowe. He's not alive anymore, but that's a name we ought to know. Anyway, we saw Detroit fall apart. Detroit is now 1/3 the size it was. 1/3 the size it was in population at its peak. It became the murder capital of the world. Its waters became polluted. Its population fell into despair. Alcoholism was rampant for older Detroiters. Drugs were rampant among younger Detroiters. And today, we all know that it's a mess. The unemployment rate, according to the New York Times, is nearly 50%. So that's negative disruption. And it's not just Detroit that is dealing with problems today. We as a people are running out of clean water globally. We're running out of fresh air. We're running out of food in many places. We're running out of fuel. Our corporations in America, 85% of American corporations are in mature categories. They are literally running out of ideas. Our government and most other governments are running out of money. And sometimes it seems like our earth is running out of time. So that's negative disruption. And yeah, boy, are we in a world with a lot of negative disruption. But fortunately, there's another definition of disruption, and that is positive. That is a good thing. And so I want to tell you a story about the world that we live in with respect to creative energy, and it started in a funny place. At the same time that it seemed like places like Detroit were falling apart, at the same time the world was in strife because of terrible race relations, terrible wars in Vietnam, and we saw people change their mind about how good it was to blindly believe in big government, big corporations, big things. Not to say that corporations are bad. I'm a capitalist. Not to say that government is bad. Well, I've got to think about that one. But 4 big trends came out of the 1960s, the same time that we saw this disruption. One was distrust for the establishment. The theme, question authority, became very popular. We saw people saying, I stick it to the man, I don't trust the establishment. We saw people reaching out for meaning. They didn't just want a job, they wanted to do things they believed in. We saw the rise of the creative class, folks like you all assembled here today. We saw more and more creativity. In fact, I am one of 9 kids who grew up in my household in Grosse Pointe. And the only one, I wanted to be an artist, right? 9 kids, imagine, all right, these are 8 chairs. This was my family photo. And I wanted to be an artist. Now, mind you, in the 1960s, when I went to my dad, who was an executive at Chrysler Corporation, said I wanted to be an artist, that was like laughed at, right? Anyone who's in this room who's about my age and who was in a creative field at that time knows how the conversation went, because we all had the same conversation. It was like, you'll never make any money doing that. You can't feed yourself doing that. And not many people did it. Today, it's fabulous. You know, everyone I meet, it's like, oh, my son's in film school. I have a son who's doing web design. I have a son who's doing sets for television shows. And not surprisingly, because when I grew up, we only had 3 networks. How many sets could you build for television shows? Today, we have hundreds of networks, all of them employing creative people. We have millions of websites, all of them hiring designers and programmers. So there's been an explosion of creativity, and it's exciting, and it started back then. And we had democratization of technology, which may have been the most significant of all. And here's a quote from Stuart Brand. If you don't know this name, you should. Stuart founded the Whole Earth catalog, but he also founded the Well, which was the Whole Earth electronic link. And the Well was one of the precursors to the internet, one of the first true online communities, before CompuServe, before AOL, before Prodigy, and if you're young, you don't even know what those names are. There was the Well, and the Well was awesome. And he said, we owe it all to the hippies. The real legacy of the 60s generation is the computer revolution. And that is the truth. The interesting thing about Brand is he made $20,000 off of selling the Whole Earth catalog. And he gave it to a friend of his who was a radical protester who had gone to jail and been on hunger strikes and things, protesting our involvement in the war. His name was Fred Moore. I want to talk about a name you should remember. It's Fred Moore. And Fred Moore took the $20,000 and they were trying to think, what should we do with it? Because they didn't want the money. Fred Moore ended up putting it in a coffee can and burying it, and there it stays. And so there was some weird thinking going on. But this weird thinking, this is Fred Moore, by the way, this weird thinking led directly to all of the powerful tools that we can now use in creativity and business. Because Fred Moore founded the Homebrew Computing Club. And the Homebrew Computing Club was in Menlo Park. And if you wonder why Silicon Valley is where it is, it's because the Homebrew Computing Club was in Menlo Park. And members of that club, there were 23 original members, which included Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and a whole bunch of other pioneers in technology. 20 different companies were launched out of the 23 people who were in that little club. And in that club, Fred Moore, because he was a social activist who spent his entire life protesting wars and such, he would counsel these folks each time they met on 2 things that to him were critically important. One was share everything. So in a lot of technology circles at that time, if you were doing any technology, you would keep it to yourself. He believed, no, we share everything with each other. You do something cool, you bring it to the group next week, you tell everyone so they can do it. It's what we think of as open source now. It made everyone in the group richer, because if 20 people come together with 20 different ideas and they share, they all leave with 20 ideas. And came in with one, they leave with 20. Fred Moore also preached that computers, he felt, could be used to empower individuals to make their world better. A radical idea at the time, because remember, at that time, the only thing that most of us thought about when we thought about computers was IBM. IBM had virtually the entire market, and IBM was a giant company that made giant computers for giant corporations and giant governments. It was all about, in the mind of these folks, it was all about massing power. And these folks wanted to break it down. And do you think that didn't influence the things that came out of these people? I think it did. In fact, I want to show you a TV spot that Apple ran. This spot ran when Steve Jobs came back to Apple. After being ousted, he came back to Apple. Apple was almost dead. And he ran this TV spot. And I want you to look at the spot and ask yourself how it relates to the disruption we're talking about today, to the creative community, and how it may have been influenced by a crazy guy like Fred Moore.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Isn't that awesome? Isn't that what we're here to talk about today? And they were talking about it in that Homebrew Computing Club, and we saw the fusion of technology and social activism. We saw the fusion of empowering tools and their ability to make us all individually powerful without having to go through the powerful places that we used to have to go through. And what we saw come out of that was a disruption. From massive power like IBM to distributed power like the dozens of computing companies that came out of that, to today where we have individual power, right? We have anyone can go on an app store and sell a software application. There is an individualized channel to power. In media, back then, we had massive power. We all watched Walter Cronkite on one of those 3 channels. Then it broke up to 100 channels, and today we have over 70 million web blogs that we go to for news and information. Individual power to publish, to distribute. We had big food companies that controlled most of the food world. We had companies like MGM and Random House, movie studios, publishing companies that you had to go through to publish things. By the way, they broke down to independent publishing and independent film at like Sundance. And now we have, anyone can publish on Amazon. Anyone here can publish a book and distribute that book. And anyone can distribute and make film. We had educational powerhouses, the Ivy League, and I think that is breaking down to cool and interesting and innovative schools all over the country like the Branson Center here in Richmond and VCU, which has some fantastic programs. And by the way, let me boast for just a moment on my fabulous students at the Branson Center, because I received a great honor earlier this year, about a month ago, to go and watch as 4 of my students were awarded a meritorious certificate of honor from the Richmond Police Department for service above and beyond the call of duty in law enforcement. Now, you may be asking yourself, what the heck? These are branding students, they're marketing students. And what were they doing on stage among police officers who were receiving the same award because they had dodged bullets and saved people's lives? Well, I have a group of students, and we talked about the power of marketing, the power of creativity to change the world. And they came up to me, led by Adam Weiss, who's a brilliant young student, and came up and said, okay, we want to work on a real project. And it so happened that earlier that week I had been called by the FBI and the ATF and the Richmond police, who had formed a coalition to step up enforcement against violent crime, and they were looking to see if they could get some help with marketing. And we get a lot of calls like this at the Brand Center, and we can't help everyone we'd love to help. And so I was about to pass on the opportunity, but the guy from the ATF says, Kelly, we have found that marketing can be as powerful a tool in law enforcement as a gun. Well, that got me. I was like, really? That's awesome. That is awesome. So I got these guys together, and I told them about the project. They weren't sure, and I said, oh, by the way, you would have to go on ride-alongs in the police cars. And they're like, awesome. So they did, and they talked to criminal psychologists, and they created what is Richmond Crime Sweep. Some of you might have seen it announced about a month ago. TV spots, the name, everything. And the police department said, when they gave this award, we have already seen an impact on crime. And I told Adam Weiss, the ringleader, I said, how does it feel to be able to create advertising that can stop a bullet? And he said, he looked at me and he said, what's next? What do we do next? Hunger? Poverty? And I'm like, wow. So anyway, we're at a time where creative people can do a lot. And by the way, when we're talking about a move from massive power to individualized power, I love the guys at NASA. I see they're a sponsor. But you know, they don't have a spaceship anymore. They have an $18 billion budget, but they don't have a spaceship. But this guy does. And the point here is that we're seeing these things that used to be centrally controlled by power, distributed. And we can all play in that game. So what I'd remember about that is that we're in a world now where it's okay to say, I'm going to stick it to the man. I'm going to fight against the big bank, the big whatever, and I'm going to come up with a better idea. And maybe that better idea is a little company like Biotaxi instead of BP. The other thing is the empowerment of individuals is becoming really a powerful tool in business. And there's one other thing, and I really want to talk about that because it's a huge issue for our times, which is creating greatness. And this is an area that I think is greatly misunderstood. I think we don't get it right on creative a lot of times. We think the wrong things. So if you think about the most innovative company in America, and there was a survey done by Business Week, what the most innovative company, actually the most innovative company in the world, and who do you think won? Yeah, Apple. Apple was named the most innovative company in America. And why that's interesting and what we can learn from Steve Jobs, and we all wish him well as he steps out of the CEO role because of his illness. They make not a lot of products. Their biggest recent innovation was in 2010, the iPad. And it was 3 years before that when they introduced the iPhone. And it was 6 years before that when they introduced the iPod. This is not a lot of different products. We tend to think of creativity as, oh man, they're doing massive amounts of products. Actually, the opposite is true. Samsung has 50 different models of phone. Apple's got this one. 50 different models of phone. Nokia has almost as many. Motorola has almost as many. BlackBerry has a dozen. And you would think, well, wow, look at all those phones. That must be the most innovative company, right? Because they're cooking up lots and lots of stuff. No. Interestingly, we didn't say that was the most innovative company. We said these guys were. They don't do a lot of things, but they do them exceptionally well. So well, they get it really right. And what we don't understand, I think, about creativity is that it's not about the massive ideas that we might have. It's about taking ideas and doing them exceptionally well, better than anyone thought. And if you can do that, if you can take an idea and do it exceptionally well, it doesn't matter if you are a powerful company in a given category. You will become powerful. Proof of that is that when Apple announced they were going to make a phone, Palm was the #1 company in smartphones. The best, the biggest. That was in 2006. And Palm CEO said, we've learned and struggled for years here figuring out how to make a decent phone. PC guys are not just going to figure this out. They're not going to just walk in. This is the fallacy of our age, that the guy who makes the car, the guy who makes the spaceship, the guy who makes the phone, the bank that's been in business for the longest time, that's massive and powerful, will be the one that holds the power tomorrow. It's not true. Palm CEO stepped down a year later. Palm as a company, the #1 company in smartphones in 2006, Palm as a company does not exist today. It's gone. It's gone. And we already know who's #1 in smartphones. The company that never in their entire history had made a phone is #1 in smartphones. We can do these things. And by the way, if you're interested in ROI, if you had invested in Apple when Steve Jobs came back and ran that TV spot, you would have a, I'm not making this up, 10,000% return on investment. Just doing a few things powerfully. And just to make sure that I prove to you that it's about doing a few things well and not doing tons of things. Oh, by the way, this is depressing, isn't it? This is really, really depressing. It's exciting for Apple, not so exciting for us. But Steve Jobs actually was CEO of another company, and he used the same model. The company was Pixar. He bought the company for $10 million when Disney turned it down. He sold the company 10 years later, after it had made only 6 movies, for $7.4 billion, which is, I can't even do the math on what the return on investment that is, but I do know that if you took $7.4 billion and then you took out the initial investment, it's still $7.4 billion. 6 movies they made, but each movie opened #1 at the box office. Every single one of the movies was nominated for an Academy Award. Almost everyone won it, and every movie that they have made since, which is very few, they're up to like 12, every single one has opened #1 at the box office. And every movie, all 12 of their movies, are on the 50 best, highest box office movies of all time. So, and they don't make a lot, you know, 1 a year, 1 every 2 years. And by the way, the second most innovative company, some of you thought it was the most innovative, Google. And Google, that is Google's interface. Most of Google's money comes from their search. The vast majority of their money comes from their search. And that is their search their search engine when they launched as a beta site before they even came out to the public. And underneath it is the search now. Talk about simplicity and focusing on a few things. To put that in perspective, this was their office when they launched that first site. I am not kidding you. That was their office. And these are their headquarters today. They have them all over the world. A few simple, powerful things. And by the way, when we talk about how we're in a world where we are making powerful tools to empower individuals to do things they couldn't do before. This is a TV spot that I have to show because it was designed by one of our graduates at the Brand Center, and it ran on the Super Bowl, but it speaks to Google's empowering individuals, and I'm going to show it for you.
Hello. Bonjour.
Isn't it nice? Tristan Smith wrote that ad, and I just love it. So let me end by coming back to my story about Detroit, because I hate to leave you in a depressing place as it relates to Detroit. So where are we now with Detroit? Well, the city has cleaner air, cleaner water, in fact, very clean water, fresher air. Crime is way down, businesses are coming back, and creativity is fueling all of this. In fact, here's an article, recent article from the New York Times, Youthful Creative Detroit crawls out of the shadow of decline. Young creative people are moving to Detroit, launching new businesses and civic ventures that are creating a new identity for the city plagued by associations with decline. And I don't think that's surprising, because when you have a place that's risky to be in, people who are not risk takers, people who are not innovators, people who are not creative, they're not going to go there, because why would you? But people who are innovative and creative, they'll say, hell yeah, I'm up for the challenge. Let's see what we can do with this place. It is people like those of us in this room today that are going to help us change the world. And it's exciting to me that it only takes a small amount of people to make a really big difference. So I will end with this quote, one of my favorites. Never doubt that a small group of dedicated people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever did. Thank you very much. And